You know, in recent years, one of the major economic themes that's come to dominate public discussion has been the growing inequality gap in America. It's a theme we're likely to hear a lot about in the 2016 presidential election, and no doubt the solutions that candidates put forward will differ widely, which makes this evening's talk by an expert on the subject especially timely. Inequality is an issue that Joseph Stiglitz has been thinking and writing about for decades. His own research on this subject started back when he was a graduate student at MIT and Fulbright scholar at Cambridge, which, as he notes in his new book, was long before the subject turned as hot as it is now in the economics profession. Over the past half century, Joe has, of course, become one of the most accomplished economists of our era, with influential work spanning the worlds of academia, public policy, and popular literature. He has taught at Princeton, Stanford, MIT, and Oxford, and for the past decade and a half at Columbia University. He headed the Council of Economic Advisors under President Clinton and has served as chief economist at the World Bank and as head of several international commissions or expert groups. In 2001, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics for his analyses of markets with asymmetric information, and he shared in the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize as a lead author of the 1995 report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He's also currently president of the International Economic Association. After many years of writing academic papers, Joe in the past 15 years or so has demonstrated a knack for writing articles and books that have made complex economic ideas accessible and interesting to the general public. Since the early years of the Bush administration, he's co-written or authored 9 books on such topical issues as globalization, financial market deregulation, and remedies for recovering from the Great Recession. In his new book, The Great Divide, Unequal Societies and What We Can Do About Them, Joe examines how inequality threatens prosperity, and he outlines reforms that would promote opportunity, growth, and equality. The book is largely a collection of articles and essays written for the New York Times, Vanity Fair, and several other periodicals or newspapers over the past few years, but organized as they are into sections with introductions that allow some fresh commentary by Joe. They together provide a coherent, useful, and I think persuasive argument that the divide we're now experiencing is not inevitable or irreversible and can be addressed by political choices, albeit some very, very tough ones. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Joseph Stiglitz.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here again, and thank you for the introduction. Whenever you write something, you often like to get some pushback because if you don't get a pushback, you always worry that maybe you said something that was so anodyne that nobody could disagree. So I was a little pleased yesterday when the Wall Street Journal attacked me. They complained that I was complaining about inequality. And I think the real subtext of what they wanted is they thought there was too little inequality, and they thought I was arguing that we had too much inequality. So, there is a somewhat of a debate, and it was pointed out, this will be a big issue in the 2016 campaign. Everybody will talk about it. The real question is, what will they really mean? And do they want to increase it or decrease it? Although nobody will openly say that. My own interest, as pointed out, actually began in inequality, began in some sense as I was growing up, because I grew up in Gary, Indiana, which I don't know how many of you know is a steel town in the southern tip of Lake Michigan. It is symbolic of America's industrialization and deindustrialization. So it was founded in 1906 as the largest integrated steel mill in the world, and to show that the sense in which it was a company town. The name of the city, Gary, is named after the chairman of the board of U.S. Steel. Now, you can't be more corporate than that. Well, when I was growing up, you look around, and if you weren't blind, you would see enormous amount of discrimination, very high level of inequality, and episodic unemployment. You know, classmates, every 3 or 4 years, their parents would be laid off as the economy entered another cycle. What I didn't realize at the time, that this was the golden age of capitalism. I didn't realize that in some sense until I went to graduate school, and I was told that markets are efficient and perfect. And I couldn't quite figure that out and reconcile that with what I saw. And of course, that really motivated my life's work, which has been trying to understand where those textbook models were wrong. One of the ways in which they were wrong is they actually said that inequality was of no concern. And that was why traditionally economics textbooks really didn't devote any time to the subject. In fact, Bob Lucas, a professor at University of Chicago, got a Nobel Prize, actually made a speech not that long ago in which he said it was essentially a sin to talk about it. It was the most dangerous, invidious thing to do, to talk about inequality. I won't fully describe what's going through their minds. It's a long topic, and I've been told I only have about half an hour. So maybe in the question period I could talk about some of the things that I won't be able to finish really go into depth on. But I wound up writing my thesis on the subject that really had motivated me to go into economics and to leave physics, which is what I had planned to do when I in college. Bob Solow, who was my teacher, had written his thesis on inequality and distribution of income. But the subject didn't get much attention, so when I published the main chapter of my thesis on the distribution of income and wealth among individuals in Econometrica, it didn't get that much of a readership. At least it got much less of a readership than when I published an article more recently in Vanity Fair. The article in Vanity Fair was called "Of the 1%, by the 1%, and for the 1%." And that article really says a lot about what I'm going to say in one sentence, because it emphasizes the political nature of inequality, that it's not just a matter of economics. So what the articles, the essays in this book brought together by trying to link them and highlight some of the underlying themes, is that they try to trace out the very many different dimensions of inequality in our society. It's not just about income, and wealth is even more. There are inequalities of health that all of you know about. There are inequalities, really important inequalities in access to justice that we often neglect, and came out very clearly in the response, to the financial crisis, when on the one hand, people were thrown out of their homes who didn't even owe money in the robo-signing scandal, and not a single one of the major bankers have been held accountable. So that just is a little bit of the flavor of the inequality of access to justice. One aspect of inequality that I am going to talk about is inequality of opportunity. So I can talk about the dimensions of inequality, the causes, how did we get here, and including the role of the recession in exacerbating inequality, just a number that many of you may know about, but Officially, the recession ended in 2009, but in the 3 years following the end of the recession, 91% of all the gains went to the top 1% of the country, which meant the 99% didn't see essentially any increase in their income. And finally, I talk about some of the consequences, what we can do about it, compare what is going on in the United States and what's going on elsewhere, and emphasize the fact that this inequality is not inevitable. It's a matter of our choices. So in these few minutes that I have this evening, I want to go through 7 or 8 ways in which our understanding of inequality has changed dramatically in recent years. The first has to do with something that's called Kuznick's law. Simon Kuznick won the Nobel Prize, and he articulated in the 50s this idea that in the initial stages of development, inequality would increase, but then as economies got richer, it would decrease. And there are strong theoretical reasons that we see, for instance, in China, why in the initial stages it increases, parts of the country succeed faster than others, and they pull out, and that grows inequality, and then the others catch up and inequality decreases. That particular history described the United States very well at that time when he was writing in the 50s. And that continued for several decades afterwards. But then, around 1980, the United States took a different turn. And rather than following Kuznick's law, it went, and which was an inverted U shape, it started to increase. Inequality increased dramatically. And so, to echo what I said at the beginning, we now realize that the period, the 50s, 60s, was the golden age of capitalism in America. It was the period where we became a middle-class society, and many of our views of ourselves and others' views of us were really shaped in this golden age of capitalism. So the natural question is, what happened? Why was this particular period such a period of success? How is it different from what has happened in the 70 years since then? And there are 2 hypotheses, and both may have some grain of truth in them. One is that had to do with the World War II. World War II brought the country together. We all had to fight against common enemy. There was a kind of solidarity, social cohesion. And that enabled a whole set of policies to be adopted, more progressive taxation, education policies, a whole set of policies that really transformed the country and did make it into this middle-class society, this land of opportunity that we thought we were. So one hypothesis is that as the time went after the war, that kind of sense of social cohesion eventually weakened. We became more selfish, and by the 80s, that era of social cohesion had come to an end. There's another hypothesis that's complementary to this, was that the 70s was a very difficult period in the United States. We had inflation, we had high unemployment, stagflation is what it was called, and many people thought we ought to try another strategy. Now, the particular strategy that was argued for, which is sometimes called supply-side economics, many of us thought was not a good idea at the time. The idea was that by lowering taxes at the top, removing regulations, you would incentivize the economy and remove the constraints, and that would lead to faster economic growth. I think everybody recognized that it would lead to more inequality, but the idea was that because the economic pie would be bigger, even if the people in the middle and the bottom got a smaller share, they would be better off because the size of their slice would be bigger, because the whole pie would be that much bigger. Well, we now have a third of a century of evidence on this, and I have to say that we ought to declare that particular experiment a failure. The fact is that growth has been markedly slower than it was in the decades after World War II. The one thing about the experiment that was predicted was that it led to more inequality. But I don't think even they all thought, the advocates thought, it would lead to the level of increase in inequality that they anticipated. The top 1% now gets 25% of the income. Their share of the income has doubled. The share of the top one-tenth of percent has increased 3 to 4-fold. This growth in inequality has been so bad that those in the middle have seen their income stagnate. Incomes today, adjusted for inflation in the middle, are lower than they were a quarter century ago. And that's the average for our society. If you look at various demographic groups, things are a lot worse. So one demographic group that I feel some affinity to is males. And the median income of a full-time male worker is lower than it was 40 years ago. So if you want to understand some of American politics and the anger that you see in some groups, I think it's not a surprise given that they were told that every generation was going to be better, and there's been now 40 years of stagnation. At the bottom, things are even worse. The minimum wage has been basically stagnant for a half century. And just to put it in context, you know, the last 35 years are 35 years in which incomes in China have been multiplied by 8-fold. 500 million people moved out of poverty while we increased the numbers and percentage of our society in poverty. So these are just dramatic differences. The second big idea or big change in our understanding has to do with trade-offs. Economists like to talk about trade-offs. Art Okun, who was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Johnson, wrote a very famous book called The Big Trade-Off, where he talked about the trade-off between growth, economic performance, and inequality. And his argument was that if you want to get a more equal society, you have to give up on economic performance, on growth. And that was the common wisdom at that time. Today, we realize that that's not true. That, in fact, economies that have more equality perform better. And this is not just, you might say, a left of center or a left-wing view. Of course, some of us on that side talked about that for a long time, but now that's even become a centrist view. The IMF, as you know, is not a far-left organization. The IMF has made a centerpiece of its policies over recent years, emphasizing that inequality is bad for economic performance, leads to more instability, lower economic growth. They've done a whole research program, not only empirically verifying and trying to identify the channels through which this happens. There's a lot of interesting theoretical work trying to explain why this is and how it comes about. But this idea now, I think, is fairly widely accepted. And that really changes our view of policy, because it means that we can have a more equal society. In fact, not only can we have a more equal society, if we have a more equal society, we will be doing better. And I'll come back and talk to you about some aspects of that a little bit later if I have time. The third idea that I want to change in our understanding relates to these two aspects of inequality that I mentioned before: inequalities of income, outcomes, wealth on the one hand, and inequality of opportunity. When the discussion, the debate about inequality began a few years ago, some people on the right said, oh, we don't care about inequality of income. That's a socialist idea. What we care about is equality of opportunity. That's the American values. Unfortunately, what he didn't go on to say is we are not doing very well on that. That we had the highest level of inequality among the advanced countries, but we have among the worst levels of equality of opportunity among the advanced countries. And what that means, yes, some people do make it from the bottom to the top. Maybe many of you have done that. But from the point of view of an economist or social scientist, what they talk about is the probabilities. What is the likelihood? What are your chances? And in those terms, the life prospects of a young American are more dependent on the income and education of his parents than in other advanced countries. That has an important implication that you should keep in mind. The most important decision that you will ever make is choosing your parents. And once you make that decision badly, the game is over. So the basic point is, there are a number of reasons for this, but a key part of this is educational opportunity, which is very linked to parental income and education. The fourth idea is something that struck me a great deal when I was at the World Bank. I had a chance to travel all over the world. In fact, we did too much traveling. But what I got to see is that there are a great deal of differences across countries. And when you look at the statistics, they verify these impressions that the United States, as I said before, has more inequality than other advanced countries and less equality of opportunity. The reason that that's particularly important is that the economic forces that are at play in all the advanced countries are very similar. That is to say, the drivers of, when you might think of the drivers of inequality, things like globalization, technology, skill bias, technical change, whatever those underlying drivers, they're basically global in nature. But how the system, our economic, social, political systems, take those and shape our societies, shape our economy, really varies across countries. And what that means, it's not economics, and I shouldn't be saying this as an economist, but it's not economics that fundamentally determines the degree of inequality. It's the policies, and the policies are driven by our politics. And as we've thought about this issue and trying to understand what are the aspects of policies, what we come to understand is it's every aspect of our economic and political structure. So what I mean by that is our tax structure. Taxes we often think of as affecting the redistribution, but actually taxes affect what people do. And so they actually affect the market distribution of income. So they affect, if you have a system that encourages people to go into speculation, into finance, and finance is an area where there's a lot of inequality, you're going to wind up with a lot of inequality. If you have a tax system that encourages, as our tax system does, non-transparent stock options, so that people don't know how much the CEO is getting paid, you open the door to very high CEO pay. So both through our laws and corporate governance and our tax system, we've wound up in a system where over the last 35 years, the ratio of CEO pay to ordinary workers' pay has increased from 30 to 1 to close to 300 to 1. The lack of transparency in all this is very important. In the Dodd-Frank bill, there was a provision that corporations had to disclose that number. But guess what? The law was passed in 2010, and the Securities and Exchange Commission that is responsible for writing the regulations has not yet written the regulations. Now, you wouldn't think it's that difficult to write a regulation. Just tell us what the number is. And they haven't been able to do it because the corporations don't want this to happen. There are lots of battles I can tell about. When we had a battle over even the tax provision when I was in the Clinton administration, the particular tax provision that encouraged this kind of stock options, which are actually have nothing to do with incentives, because your stocks go up if the interest rate goes down. The CEO is not responsible for the interest rate going down, yet he gets a bonus every time the Fed lowers the interest rate. Now, does that make any sense? Obviously it doesn't, and I pointed that out well before they adopted this provision. But there was one member of the economic team who previous year had gotten a $25 million bonus, and he thought this was actually a good idea. But then we said, as time went on, we saw what was going on, and we said, well, at least the shareholders should know what's going on. What you do when you grant stock options, it's not manna from heaven. It looks like it's manna from heaven. You give something to somebody, and it doesn't come out of anybody's pocket. Well, if you believe that, you don't believe in the laws of conservation of nature. And, this is basic physics. I don't know how many took basic law of conservation, is first law that you have to learn. Well, what it goes on when you give stock options, you're diluting the ownership shares of other people, of the existing shareholders. We wanted to get disclosure. Again, not a big deal, but information matters. That was the whole point of what I got a Nobel Prize for. Information matters. So, what do you think those in the financial markets and the CEOs said? Oh, that'll just confuse them. And they worked very hard to stop this disclosure, and they succeeded. Arthur Levitt, who was the head of the SEC, said it was the biggest mistake he made when he was chairman of the SEC not to push that through. So, what I want to give, I just give a few examples to give you a feeling how every aspect of our legal system, antitrust, can help lead to the growth of inequality. One of the striking statistics that shows that it's not just ordinary market forces, that over the last 40 years, productivity of the American worker has actually increased quite significantly. It's doubled. But what's happened to wages? Completely stagnant. Now, this is a new era. It's never been like this. In every other country, in every other period, when productivity goes up, wages track, and not perfectly, but pretty well. Never has there been this kind of opening gap of this magnitude. Well, the next point I want to make is when we talk about, is related to the notion of trade-offs. When you talk about this kind of inequality, talk about the need for more education, a response that you often hear is, we can't afford it. It's beyond our reach. And let me just say, that's nonsense. And a couple of essays in the book try to bring that out. One of them was one of my travels. I went to Mauritius, which some of you may know is an island off of the east coast of Africa. It's one of the most successful developing countries. It's been growing very rapidly. It's still a poor country. I mean, it's still not very well off. But they decided that they wanted to go a different route. So for all their citizens, they have free health care, free college education, free public transportation for the youth because of their future, and for the old people because they did so much for the country. And when you see that, your answer is, if they can afford to do these things, adjusted obviously for the standard of living, the quality, the education isn't the same, the healthcare isn't the same, but if they can afford it, can't we? We're so much richer. But another way of saying the same thing is to think back in our own past. At the end of World War II, we ended that war, as I mentioned before, with a sense of solidarity, cohesion. We ended that war too, though, with a debt-GDP ratio of 130%. Much higher than Greece's debt-to-GDP ratio when it reached that crisis in 2010 of 110%. And everybody said, oh, it's a disaster. I won't go on to how Europe mismanaged that. That's another topic. But But at the end of the war, did we say we were poor? No, we didn't say that we were poor. What did we do about education? We said that everybody who had fought in the war, which was essentially every able-bodied young person, every male and a lot of women, had the right to go to 4 years of college at the best college they could get into. Now, the United States is having a debate about whether we can afford community colleges for poor people. If we could afford that then, we can obviously afford it now. Our income then was much, much lower than it is now. So it's not about what we can afford, it's about what we choose and how we as a nation choose to spend our money. And so this is a theme that I talk about over and over again, that the inequality that we have is a political choice. And that brings me to the issue of how those choices are made in our politics. And that really is the theme of that original Vanity Fair article. Whenever you have a high degree of economic inequality like we have in the United States, that gets translated into political inequality. And especially because when you have that kind of political inequality, you can help write rules that make money talk louder. So we've evolved into a democracy that is better described as $1 one vote than one person one vote. And when that happens, obviously, you get policies that reinforce the economic inequality. Well, I've talked a lot about inequality at the top, and I could have also talked a lot about the increase, and I mentioned the inequality at the bottom, the poverty at the bottom, but I want to emphasize one of the reasons that the issue of inequality has reached the top of the political agenda is that there's been a hollowing out of the middle class. That, as I pointed out, median income has been stagnant for 25 years. That basically, if we look at what we used to think of as the basic ingredients of a middle class lifestyle, very hard to achieve. Just to talk about one example, people used to think that education, a college education for their children, was a basic necessity for getting forward. But tuition has been soaring. Understandable, given that the stakes have been cutting back in the support of education. But with incomes going down and tuitions going up, there's a huge gap. And the answer, the way that gap typically gets filled is through debt. And student debt now has risen to over $1 trillion, it's more than credit card debt. Typical student graduating has a debt of over $25,000. People who go on to graduate school often have debts of well over $100,000. That affects what they can do. It affects our economy because they can't spend things on others. They can't start their life. It is really affecting in very fundamental ways the nature of our society. So this is really a big deal. To go back to the point about their alternatives, other societies poorer than us have addressed this in other ways. So that, for instance, in Scotland, they've been trying to they've been bringing down tuition and actually opening up their universities and trying to make access to education much broader. In fact, it's one of the reasons that for the referendum that they had last September, because UK was following the American model, raising tuition and reducing access. Scotland said that's not the model that we want to go towards. We want to go to a different kind of economic and social system. And that was a big part of what was driving the referendum in Scotland. Other countries, like Australia, have introduced income contingent loans where they say every student can get a loan to finance it, but what you repay depends on your income. So it's not the kind of burden that the fixed debt, exploitive debt, that American students have had to face. The final point I want to raise is these problems won't be solved by small tweaks in the system. They're not going to be solved quickly. You don't have something that's grown the way inequality has grown in the United States over a third of a century, step by step, with all these regulations, laws, tax structures. You're not going to undo it overnight. And that means that we ought to have two aspects of our policy agenda. One, to start thinking about how do we reform the economic structure to make sure that we get more equality. I'm not talking about complete equality here, but just reducing the extremes of inequality that are so eviscerating of our economy, our society, our democracy. But the second thing is that while that's going on, we really need to think about how do we make sure that everybody can attain those basic necessities, what we view as the basic ingredients of a middle-class life. You know, access to college for their children, home ownership, participation in the labor force, being able to get to a job. Some of you may, that's a big thing for a lot of people in our, just child care, family leave. There are a whole actual large agenda to try to make access to the basic ingredients of a decent life available to more Americans. So let me just conclude with a note of urgency. As I said before, we began 35 years ago with this experiment. It hasn't worked out. But what we do now in the next few years will have effects years and years from now. Just like the decisions we made in 1980 are having effects now, the decisions we make now will determine the nature of our society in 2030, 2040, 2050. If we want to continue to have a more unequal society, if we want to wind up living behind gated communities, we know what to do. Just continue the current course. On the other hand, as you can suspect, I think we ought to try something different. I think this hasn't worked. It hasn't worked for us as a whole, and it hasn't worked for vast parts of our country. It has worked for a few people in the 1%, but it has not worked for our economy, for our democracy, or for our society. So what I hope, and part of the reason I wrote the book, is I hope we take the second course. Thank you.
So again, if you have a question, please try to go to that microphone over there or that microphone there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Do you think the physical form that we now find our cities and our non-cities in exacerbates this division?
Oh, very much so. I mean, one of the problems I mentioned just very briefly towards the end, that one of the problems is that poorer people, and not just poor people live in parts of cities where they can't even get access to jobs. There's no public transportation. And just think of what that means. They have to buy a car. As I tease my students, when you're poor, what kind of car can you buy? A poor car. And the problem with poor cars is they break down. And when they break down, you don't get to work. Your boss isn't very happy with it. You get fired. So your life is at the edge. And so public transportation is an absolute ingredient. But it's more than public transportation. It's trying to change the structure of our cities. It's one of the reasons that de Blasio in New York is trying to make sure that we have a more integrated housing stock, that we have our community is a really economically integrated, and that we have good public transportation as an absolute ingredient for addressing the problem of inequality.
Hi, thank you for the talk. Totally with you. Oh my God, I can't talk. Your conclusions, yes, and what you would like to do. It sounds like Ms. Clinton is talking a bit about income inequality, as you say. I don't think, in my wonderful thinking, whatever good that is, that much is going to happen until the political pendulum swings back from the hard turn to conservatism that it has done, and presumably that's not going to continue forever. And I don't think any major reform is going to get done before we have another economic crisis, because when there was the Great Recession, they could have gotten something done, but Obama wanted to do health care and can't.
Yeah.
What's your question?
Oh, what do you think of my ideas? Is this right?
So, yeah, I'm actually hopeful with the fact that Americans are becoming very aware that something's happened to our economy, to our society, and to our democracy. You see it, it's bubbling up, the debate of campaign contributions about the way it's distorting our politics, the idea that their inequality is so large. You know, it's hard for people not to know that something's not working right, because almost everybody, even the people in the 1%, know people who aren't doing very well. So the fact is, that's one of the reasons I'm optimistic. It's a qualified optimism because, as I said, our political system is distorted. And I think the election in 2016 is going to be very important because there will be an opportunity to shift the pendulum a little bit. So these are slow things. It's not going to happen overnight. But just getting this issue on the national debate agenda, I think, has been an achievement.
Professor, I'm particularly interested in the linkages between income inequality, credit, and financial crises. You alluded to the channels briefly in your talk. And I think in the past you've written that it may be at the bottom end of the income inequality spectrum where people are demanding credit to sustain their consumption in the face of stagnating incomes. Can you talk a little bit about that, and whether it's
Sure.
the bottom end or the credit supply side?
Finance and credit has a lot to do with inequality in the United States in very many different ways. One of them, of course, is the obvious. It was very obvious in the run-up to the crisis that there was a lot of predatory lending, a lot of discriminatory lending. So that's one channel where you basically run your financial system to exploit people at the bottom, and you move money to the top. That creates inequality of both kinds. The financial sector has a lot of market power, and where that's particularly important is the running of the payments mechanism, credit cards, debit cards, and they use that to charge really abusive prices. Merchants have to pay large fees. Something that should cost a fraction of a penny for a transaction, they charge 1, 2, 3, 4%, giving them tens of billions of dollars a year. Well, the Dodd-Frank recognized the problem, fixed it only in one small part, which is on the debit card, but made a big mistake. It delegated responsibility for doing anything about it to the Federal Reserve, which is largely captured by the financial market. And what happened then? The staff came out with a recommendation. Their recommendation, I think, was twice of what it should have been on the maximum fee, and the Fed doubled that number. It was so outrageous that the judge reviewing it really got angry and threw out of the decision, and then when an appellate, as you know, our legal system can go through. But the basic thing, anybody looking at that should have been outraged. So that's a second. A third, though, way in which it's really caused inequality is the expansion of credit is one of the reasons why land prices, real estate goes up. And who tends to benefit? Those who already own real estate. So it expands the wealth inequality. Some of you may, I don't know if Piketty was here last year or no, what?
We didn't get him, unfortunately.
Okay, so anyway, in his book he talks about the role of wealth, capital, and increasing inequality. What he misses is a couple of things. One of the things he misses in this is that if you look at the real savings, people in national income accounts not spending money, that can account for only a fraction, about half, of what has been happening to the increase in wealth. And you ask, what is the other part of the increase in wealth? Well, it's things like capital gains on land and the capitalization of monopoly profits. That's enormous. And it goes all to the people at the top. And one of the implications of this is that it's not really about capital in the 21st century, capitalism in the 21st century. It's about our policies, about democracy in the 21st century. And that's what's driving the inequality. Because the financial sector, the way it behaves is really structured by the rules, regulations, the opportunities, incentives that we provide.
I've been a fan for a long time. I came here early just to be sure I could see you, and I've already bought the book. Following up on the financial question, what do we do about what I would call disinvestment? Maybe that's not a good word, but the kind of thing Bain Capital did and many other private equity firms, where they would buy a company, fire half the employees, make the remaining half do twice as much, end the pension plan, take the money from that had been accumulated for the defined benefit plan, and switch the workers to a defined contribution plan, turn them into contractors, independent contractors, so they were no longer responsible for anything.
Yeah. So these kind of anecdotes actually are capturing something real that's going on at a macroeconomic level. When we used to talk about banking, some of you may have studied finance when you were younger. You used to think of what banks do. Finance is what they call it. The word was intermediation.
Right.
They took money from savers and they brought it to the firms, who would then take that and invest it well. That's a nice story, and the banks still tell that story. It's just not true of America's financial system. If you look at the flow of funds, the main role of the financial system now, in recent years, and it's been actually several years now, has been to take money out of the corporation and distribute it to the big shareholders. So what is the implication of that? There's less money that's being reinvested. And that fits in with the point I made before, that actually, you look at the real savings in the United States, we're not even able to keep up with the increase in our national income. The real capital output ratio has probably been going down. And it's one of the reasons why we're not doing very well. So what you mentioned in terms of these anecdotes of Bain are not just anecdotes, they are really a statistically significant aspect of what's going on in our macroeconomy.
Thank you.
Thank you. I need the Gene Sperling level. It's just a little down. My name is Andrew Terrell, and I did my grad school over at Warwick in the UK, and I have a question on institutions. From my study over there, it appeared as if my British colleagues are a little bit more historically and institutionally aware than a lot of my American colleagues. You get to read things like Heilbronner and what have you. You get to see the evolution of economics. I get the sense from my American colleagues that they don't really have that sort of focus in their economics education. And my question is, without that, how do we build functional institutions? Because with your example on the SEC, even when we can pass a bill like Dodd-Frank, if the institutions can't implement it, then it's worthless. So even if democracy can make a little bit of a change through the legislature, without functioning institutions, we can't get anything done. And how do we do that? And also, what are the conversations and the regulators and the folks in academia and private business that you see as champions of this issue?
Well, you're absolutely right that we've come to understand that economics cannot be simply described with demand and supply curves. And people who've tried to analyze what's happening to inequality in terms of demand and supply curves have just gotten it wrong. They really haven't captured what is going on. And this institutional perspective is really the kind of perspective that I've been arguing for. Now, the good news is that there is, I don't want to say, a movement that to try to bring this more into economics. And it's a broad-based movement, and even people somewhat on the right side have emphasized this. There is something called the Institute for New Economic Thinking that is making a very strong push to try to incorporate these kinds of ideas and recognize that our models didn't do very well before the crisis. To just point out something that should be obvious, and that we need new economic models, and it's making significant inroads in at least some of our institutions, not in all of them.
Yes, my concern is more about the politics of all this than the economics. I think everybody in this room pretty much agrees with you that things have gone to hell in a handbasket and we have to do something about it. But the problem, and I think most people probably agree with this too, is one political party basically consists of paid employees of those who would benefit quite handsomely from the continuation of the system, and they have a constituency. And I'm not sure just an election of 2016 is going to do anything about that. There has to be more, and I'm hoping that you have some ideas of what les sans-culottes or whatever do for more.
Well, one of the real problems, when I look at what's happening, what I see is a majority of Americans are actually not benefiting from the kind of model that began in 1980. So if one could get people to understand that model is broken and that there are alternatives, then I think maybe we can get a change. Now the problem, so let me say 2 points for that. One of the problems has been that because there is the power of money has actually led some parts of the Democratic Party actually to be a little bit too affiliated with the financial system, shall we say, and not do some of the things that ought to be have done. There's a kind of disillusionment, quite frankly, and that's why in the 2014 election, voter turnout was dismal. And obviously, if people who have a stake in the outcome aren't voting, I mean, then the people who like the current system turn up because they want to continue the current system, then we're going to get an outcome which just perpetuates the current system. So part of this is trying to make it more likely that whoever's the Democratic candidate will espouse views that are more consistent with those that I'm putting forward. And the other one is to try to make sure that more voters recognize that there's a lot at stake, that there is an alternative. If it were just a matter of economic forces, you could go home and say, oh, well, it's too bad that the laws of nature worked out this way, and I wish I were born in a different universe, but we only have one universe, and you just accept it. But what I'm trying to argue is that, in fact, it's not the laws of nature, it's not the laws of economics, it's the way we run our politics, and there's a little hope in that.
Okay, thanks.
Hello, my name is Laurus Gudmundsson. Thank you for an excellent lecture. So my background is more like in science and medicine, epidemiology. I'm from Iceland, so we had a brilliant class, which you have covered. And so there we have sort of like a, let's say, Scandinavian system, but we are moving very fast towards American system, at least. So there's a big struggle there. But my question is sort of like, okay, in the 80s, we had less computation powers. The models were maybe a little bit less accurate or something like that. But now we have much better computation power, so we can actually calculate things better and model things, at least what happened. So, but my feeling is this, that we are sort of devaluing education and sort of like a real debate. It's being devalued every year. So I feel sort of like it's a little bit like a cultural revolution, that it doesn't really matter if you get an education or you try to figure things out. It's just like supporting one football team against another. So my question is that will we just end up like with religion, or it doesn't matter what the evidence is?
Yeah, I mean that has been one part, one difficulty in this arena, and you see it so much more forcefully in the discussion of climate change. That 40% of Americans, only 40% of Americans recognize climate change as a reality. Very different from other countries. One of the astounding statistics that shows an aspect of inequality in the United States is that you would have thought that people who are more educated, including in science, would have greater recognition of the importance of climate change. In the United States, that's true in almost all countries, but another aspect of American exceptionalism is it's not true here. And then you ask the question, why? And that actually is somewhat insightful. The reason that is true, it's not true, is that we have two parties, and one of the parties has disproportionately wealthy people and has come under the influence of corporate influence of coal, oil, and all that. And as a party, they've come to share a common view that is not based on science. And they've come to the view, I mean, it's quite remarkable, not everyone, I don't want to, but a disproportionate large number have come to the view that climate change doesn't exist. And it's, to me, just looking at the evidence, it's just so hard. How could people come to that view? But the fact is that they have, and just like there's a America is another aspect of exceptionalism of America that we have to come to terms with is if you do a regression line, a line of the correlation between income and belief in evolution, there's a nice, very strong correlation, except one country is off that regression line. One country is high income, but acts as if it were a low income country, and that's the United States. So these are important in science, but one of the things that I try to get at here is it's also true about economics. People come to believe certain aspects of economics as a matter of religion, sometimes encouraged by, I have to say, some shoddy research by some of my colleagues. But for instance, one of the examples of that was the view that if the debt GDP ratio got over 90%, the economy was going to collapse. And there are actually no good research on, the research didn't support that. There's a famous paper by Rogoff and Reinhardt that put that idea forward. But the anecdote the example I gave before, the United States had a debt GDP ratio of 130% at the end of World War II, and the decades after that were the fastest period of economic growth. Now, another religious belief in economics that I wanted to talk about a little bit more, but I ran out of time, was the relationship between trade and growth. You hear it, including from our president, that trade doesn't cause that these trade agreements don't cause inequality, and that they do promote economic growth. The evidence on this is not very great. It's mostly a religious belief. And it's a religious belief that is related to certain special interests. And if you look at the empirical research recently, and it's quite good research, for the United States, it shows, for instance, to just give you those districts, counties in the United States where they produce goods that compete with goods that in which there's been a surge of imports, okay, have higher unemployment and lower wages. That particularly where our economic system is right now, it doesn't have to be always, but where our economic system is now, that a surge of imports will lead to more inequality and more unemployment. But the other, another religious belief almost is that stronger intellectual property rights leads to more innovation. You talk to academics, to intellectual property lawyers who are not in the employ of the drug companies, they'll say it's not true. And there was one example that was just in the paper this week, so let me mention that brings out this point very forcefully, and in a way very emotionally. You used to think that you owned your genes, but the U.S. Patent Office didn't know that. And so there was this company, Myriad, who got the patent on the two BRCA genes, and if you had those two BRCA genes, the probability that you get breast cancer is greater than 50%. So it was really important for women to know whether they had that so they could take appropriate action. They wouldn't allow anybody else to develop a test. Yale developed a test that was much better than Myriad's test, and Yale was willing, partly through the support of others, to give it away free, because they thought, as a university, their object was to make people healthy. That's what you thought you were doing. But Myriad said no. They would not allow this better test be even given, let alone given away free. The result of that is lots of women died. So this is not just a question of profits, a transfer. This was a measure life and death. Well, some of us thought that that was outrageous. We filed a suit in district court. We won. But then the drug company Myriad appealed and went to appellate court, and we lost. And then we brought it to the Supreme Court. These battles were always dramatic, and you go up and down, and you answer the question, is there hope? Well, we won in the Supreme Court. And now, just this week, there was a really interesting article pointing out that as a result of this Supreme Court decision, there's been a burst of research. And the cost has come down from somewhere between $5,000 and $2,500 to $250. And the tests have gotten better. So this shows you that you can have a more innovative system, but we had to break out of that religion that the stronger the intellectual property rights, the better. Now, why this is so important right now is the TPP, the trade agreements and the transatlantic agreement that President Obama and Republicans are trying to get through are a step backward. The USTR, U.S. Trade Representative, negotiates, does not understand intellectual property. It's trying to put provisions in this bill that would make it more difficult to regulate for health, education, the environment, every aspect of our life. For those who are lawyers, it's a provision that's equivalent to a regulatory taking provision that would make it very difficult to regulate. And an example, this is not just a hypothetical, but it's a real example. I don't know how many of you know about the Opium War. Opium in China used to have a lot of things that the West wanted, and this was in the 19th century, and the West had nothing that China wanted. So what happened? There's what we call a trade imbalance. And then Europe figured out a way of solving the trade imbalance, and it figured out that it could export opium to China. Now, as I do some teaching in the business school, the best products are those that have repeat purchase, customer loyalty, and opium was an ideal product. And so you got a lot of customer loyalty. But the Chinese government said this is not really good for our society. And they said no more opium. The European powers, supported by the United States, said, you are violating our basic rights, our right to kill, our right to export goods. And they went to war. When I say war, literally war. Twice. And that's how they got the concessions along the east coast of China. Well, the USTR, your government, our government, is now fighting the 21st century opium war. You may not know this. The new form of opium is not opium, but cigarettes. Well, there are many, actually, but it's cigarettes.
Prescription pills also.
What?
Prescription opium.
Yeah. So, but it's cigarettes. And two countries, Uruguay and Australia, have passed legislation saying that it's not banning cigarettes, but doing something really mild, like we have in the United States and like Mayor Bloomberg was trying to do in New York. You have to label the package. This is dangerous for your health. Now, in Australia, they do it a little bit more graphically. They show you what your lungs look like with smoking. And Philip Morris has taken the view, rather rightly, that this discourages sales. And so their view is that hurts their profits. Of course, that was the intent, to discourage their sales. So it's working. But under these investment agreements, Australia and Uruguay either have to cease and desist this or compensate Philip Morris. They have to pay Philip Morris not to kill people. And this is in the agreement, the trade agreement that Obama is pushing now. So if you want to understand why a lot of people are getting exercised about this, and that it's not just a minor thing. This is not just, are we going to have a little bit more imports of Japanese cars or exports of Japanese cars? This is not just about cars. This is about our lives. And this is about the kinds of regulations that I describe in my paper that create more inequality. Inequality of well-being in a fundamental sense. So that's why I'm sorry to take this opportunity, but to talk about it.
Joe, we have time for like two very quick questions.
Okay, and I'll try to answer more briefly.
I'm not sure you can answer this, but how much influence do you think that Supreme Court law allowing industry to...
Citizens United?
Exactly.
Yeah. How much?
Yes. So when we vote, are we voting for the politician, or is this the big that 1%?
Well, Citizens United is a very important case, and it is an example of the way the rules of the game change to give more influence to money. And the question is, what can we do about that? And there are two things. One, make sure that we have a government that can try to change the composition of the Supreme Court so that we don't extend those kind of rules. And there are some decisions, like in the Arizona case, that are even worse. So one of the things is to try to change the composition of the Supreme Court. But there are things that one can do in state law and in national law, even within the Supreme Court. So one of the things, for instance, very easy, that actually Senator Schumer, I think, was trying to do at one point, which was that the owners of the corporation ought to have a right to say not only how much the people who work for them get paid, that's called say and pay, but how the money is spent politically. So there have been proposals to say if you want to contribute to make a campaign contribution, you have to get a shareholder vote. Next thing is just, you own the company, you go to your shareholders. If you did that, there wouldn't be money. Most of them would not do that, I believe. And so that's an example of how a small change in the rule can have big consequences.
Hi, I'm George Greenberg, and I read your earlier book on inequality, and the takeaway I got from there was that things were different this time. I mean, you point out that we had similar inequalities at the time of the progressive movements and before the Great Depression. And the political system was able to change that. What you said in the other book, this time it's different.
Sir, can you please just get to your question? We're really out of time.
Well, I'm trying. What you said then was that this time it's different because the political system is captured by the 1%, 1/10 of 1%ers. And you said you were hopeful things could change, but it was clear that you had some doubts. Today, I'm getting a different message that you seem much more optimistic about the possibilities for political change. Bob Putnam was here last week. He was talking about kids. He says he's had conversations with you. Bob said the 19th century, the railroads owned the Pennsylvania legislature. There really wasn't much political difference. I'm just wondering whether you would agree with that as well, and if so, why you're more optimistic today.
Yeah, let me just say I am cautiously optimistic. So I don't want you to leave here thinking that this is a slam dunk. I think it's going to be very, very hard. But the optimistic point is that other societies and we have changed in the past. I mean, Brazil, it was a society of enormous inequality, and in the last 20 years there's been a consensus in both the left and the right that has brought down inequality dramatically. You see it in the Gini coefficient. So those, both in our own history, in the progressive era, in the aftermath of the Roaring '20s, we did change. So that's the basis of cautious optimism. The reason I'm a little bit more optimistic now than I was a few years ago is the fact that the issue has gone to the top of the political agenda. I never thought that the Republicans would even utter the word inequality. And that they would, the stance has been saying those words was equivalent to waging class warfare. They are now saying, they've now recognized that reality. That is the first step, but it's only the first step to dealing with the problem.
Thank you.